everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. When I first experienced sleep paralysis, I was so young I couldn't explain what was happening to me. It all sounded like some sort of nightmare. But I'd suffered night terrors before, and this was different. Surely this was real, and surely I could die. It wasn't until I was older, after seeing a sleep therapist, I learned that this thing had a name. It still felt real, but at least others had experienced it too. I wasn't going to get hurt or die. But then I did get hurt, and it scared me, got me curious. I think sometimes our experiences with the paranormal and the unknown can be similar. There's times we know exactly what's happening while it's happening, but other times it can be hours, days, even years before we understand our experiences. To this day, I don't really have an explanation for everything. Maybe that's why I'm so curious about people asking themselves the same questions. That dream that never quite felt like a dream, maybe it wasn't. Those strange things that used to happen with the lights and electronics, electrical issues, or poltergeist. Were you just being paranoid, or was that man really following you? Well, I don't know about you, but I'm curious. So, let's get started, shall we? I previously posted this somewhere else, but thought I'd share it here as well. This isn't a typical scary story, but more of a really odd situation that happened to me back in 1997. In the late 90s, early 2000s, I did trauma scene work. I was a supervisor for a crew that you never see or hear about. But we went into homes, buildings, or structures after a homicide, suicide, accidental death, or situations like those. Sometimes they were extremely gruesome, and sometimes it was as simple as removing a chair and cutting out some carpet. Oftentimes, it involved a lot of cleaning and removal to sanitize the scene, both visually and biologically. Our goal was to leave the scene as void as possible. Like if you didn't know what happened there, you had just assumed it was under renovation. The time I want to discuss happened around midday, not the usual middle of the night cleanup call. I don't know why the police and fire department always waited until night to call us, but I would say 80% of the time that's how it happened. This was a bright, sunny, not so warm day in a Los Angeles suburb. I won't give the exact location for privacy reasons, but it was an older yet very wealthy area. The kind of neighborhood you expect doctors, business executives, or other people in the entertainment industry to live in. As we pulled up to this home, it was a huge spread of mid-century modern with fancy landscaping and a long curved driveway. The place looked well kept and was probably a showcase of the neighborhood back in the 50s and 60s. Typically, I, the supervisor, would approach the door while my crew waited by the trucks. Since this was supposed to be a small job, we only had my vehicle and our service truck. I remember seeing an old, fancy Mercedes and what looked like an old Porsche in the driveway. No others, but there may have been some in the garage I didn't see. As I walked up to the door, an older woman answered my knock. She was probably in her mid-50s, well made up with lots of jewelry. She was wearing something that reminded me of Mrs. Roper from Three's Company. It wasn't cheap looking, just not the 90s style. I explained that we were there to do some cleanup work, and then I noticed she had a drink in her hand, like a martini or something. Like I said, this was the middle of the day and probably before lunch, but It's not unusual to find people drinking in a time like this. She leads me into this house, and it's surprisingly dark and hazy from cigarette smoke. Now what happened next was really odd. The entire place looked like it was a time capsule from the Mad Men era, 50s, 60s. The house wasn't what gave me the creeps, but instead, as she led me to the second den area, we passed through the front room, another living room, and a bar pool table area. This house was huge, and there were a ton of people inside, and they all looked like characters from an early 1960s movie. One guy wore a sports coat, glasses, and a boat captain's hat, while another wore a tuxedo. There was a lady in a long, full-collared evening dress, and others that looked like some weird collage mixture of people from a Rosemary's Baby themed dinner party. The amount of people throughout the house didn't add up. There was only 2 small cars in the driveway, and they each only fit 1-2 people. Where did all of these fancy folks come from? There was a low mumble of different conversations, with only an occasional glance thrown my way as we walked over the scene. One of those huge old cabinet record players was blasting Johnny Mathis. I know that because hearing "It's Not For Me To Say" made me feel like I was walking into the Twilight Zone. We finally get to the room where the suicide happened, and the deceased was in a red velvet chair. There was no gunshot, but I assumed they took a razor to their wrists. The lady stood in the doorway. As I looked over the scene, I explained that we would remove the carpet, dispose of the chair as it held most of the blood. She just nodded, still clutching her drink. I asked her to sign our work order and permission to dispose of personal property, meaning the chair. And while signing, she said, "When you're finished, just see yourself out." I told her it probably wouldn't take more than an hour, and she walked back to the party. I made the journey back to the front door, through the Johnny Mathis music, through the cigarette smoke, and through the low-toned conversations. I get back to the guys, and before leading them in, I tell them that this one's creepy. There's a freaky party going on inside, and everyone's dressed up. I lead them back to the room where they start bagging the chair and cutting the old carpet. There were black stains where the blood had dripped through, and we ended up cutting a straight line across the room to avoid moving lots of furniture. We never found out who committed suicide, but I had assumed that it was the lady's husband. As we were finishing up, I stayed behind to take the final photos. And I thought about looking for the lady, just to let her know we were finished. Even though I got the impression she would prefer it if we just left, I still just wanted to give her confirmation. So, as I slowly walked through the party areas, I noticed no one was making eye contact with me or acknowledging my presence. You would think that, if they knew about the death, it would have been the main topic of conversation, or at least of interest. I walked to the front door, turned to look back at the party trapped in a time capsule, and closed the massive door behind me. Driving away, I couldn't help but think what a strange day it had been. It was so sunny and bright outside. How many people knew we just cleaned up the remnants of someone's last moments on Earth? For starters, when this took place, I was smaller, not very strong, but I was a good runner. I always went to my friend's house at 6:45, returned between 8 and 9, but during the fall and winter months, it was much darker. This story takes place during the fall, so the roads were clear enough to ride my electric scooter home. It's faster than a 5 to 10 minute walk with headphones. It was roughly 8:45 when I started rolling my way home, and many of the walkways were pitch black. The only thing that kept me from falling was my familiarity of where the ditches were. At the halfway point, there's a path that runs behind a row of houses and alongside a school. At the end, there are lights in front of the school. Everything becomes easy to see again. But just before that is the darkest part. There's a massive ditch to the left, and with the exception of a few trees and bushes concealing its edge, it's completely hollow. There's also a smaller ditch to the right. In other words, it's the perfect place to hide from anyone without a bright light. I had just made it onto the street when I started hearing an echo of footsteps. Sounded like a second pair of feet. I rationalized it to be me slapping my foot on the concrete too hard when I pushed it off, but the steps didn't match. I slowed down and waited, barely moving as I listened. Stupid decision. And I didn't hear a sound. Relief washed over me, and I continued forward, but so did the footsteps. I didn't dare look back. I sped up, and a few seconds later, they did too. You might be wondering how they kept up with an electric scooter, but it wasn't very fast. All it really did was cut back on the amount of work I had to put in, but it was easy to catch up with if I wasn't putting my full effort into speed. I was going reasonably fast, refusing to look back or give any indication I was suspicious. Once closer to home, I began thinking, this is ridiculous. You're just overreacting about an echo. You're acting like a 9-year-old. Feeling a bit better, that's when I turned onto my street, and the most ear-splitting whistle sound came from behind me and to my right. I turned to look for only a second, but I didn't want to die, so I booked it. Without making a sound, I took off, almost destroying my shoes in the process of making it home. And I heard nothing except my own feet hitting the ground. Luckily, the garage was wide open. I rushed inside, closed it, and looked out to see if anyone was there. I never saw the person. I was scared to death for the rest of the week. Whenever I went to my friend's house, I never took that route again. Some people say it was my imagination, but even if it were, where the hell did the whistle come from? I've struggled with the idea of sharing my experience, but mostly because I'm not sure if it actually happened or if it was just a dream. One summer, when I was 10 or 11, I was awake in the middle of the night. I could hear the horses running around the pasture as if something had happened. I decided to go check on things. At that time, my family had a massive old barn. We lived in the middle of nowhere. I walked through the barn door and found a very large man, as white as snow, climbing into the hayloft. I remember being startled, but not frightened. He turned around, looked at me, and slowly lowered himself back down. Then he took a few steps before kneeling and putting his hand out, like one would do to a stray animal. As I looked at him, I felt like he looked sad and tired, not at all like he would harm me. I took his hand and walked him towards our kid hangout space, which was just an area in the barn where we had some old couches, a few toys, and a radio. The moment he saw the radio, he became more animated, ran towards it, started messing with it. That went on for a bit. I kept asking why he needed the radio. He never said a word, not one word. He wouldn't tell me his name, so I started calling him Radio. After a while, he put the radio down and sat on the couch. I brought over my favorite horse book and I started thumbing through the pages, showing him all of my favorite breeds. Eventually, he gently took the book from me and closed it, as if to say, "I'm done." I got up and I put the book away, and he laid on the couch. I remember him being so large that his head was on the armrest while his legs hung over the other side at the knee. He was a giant, pure white, and I don't recall any hair. His eyes were jet black, but they weren't huge or angular. If anything, they slanted downward and were beady. After he fell asleep, I decided to go to bed too, but first I put a blanket over him. I woke up in the morning and the whole experience came flooding back to me. My feet were dirty, as if I'd been outside during the night. I grabbed some snacks, ran to our hangout space, and found everything as I would have expected it. The blanket was on the floor, the book sitting on the table. The radio was out of place, but he was gone. It's important to know that I had a habit of sleepwalking at this time in my life, so it's possible that this was all just a dream. At first, I thought he was just a very strange person, and I hoped he found safety. The memory never left me. By the time I was a teen, I decided the whole thing was a dream and let it go. Then Prometheus came out, and I agreed to go see it with friends. When the tall, white alien came onto the screen, I nearly jumped out of my seat. It wasn't an exact match, but it was like seeing a ghost. At the time, I knew absolutely nothing about aliens, and the only ones I'd ever heard of were the classic little green men. Nonetheless, I forced myself to let it go and move on. The memory couldn't be real, so I must have dreamt it. As more time passed, I began to wonder how I could imagine a being that I'd never seen or heard of. Could it have really happened? Could radio be real? Has anyone else ever had an experience like this? I'm a woman who experiences sleep paralysis often, and it's not fun. I recently moved into a new house in a beautiful village with a gorgeous view of the river. But what happened here, it's horrible. I lived a normal life, made friends in town. Life seemed perfect. Then one night I woke up and I couldn't move. This seemed I regularly experienced sleep paralysis, but after a few minutes, I looked out the window and I saw a boy. He had an unusually large grin. It seemed to be full of evil. Since I was paralyzed, I couldn't react. Then, the figure walked towards the door. I heard it open, and I heard his wet footsteps coming closer and closer, until the boy entered my room. He leaned over me, his huge grin directly above my face. Then I snapped out of the paralysis and was asleep again. When I woke up, I found wet footprints on my floor, and a chill ran down my spine. I got dressed and drove into town. There, I talked to people who shared a tragic story. Long ago, a group of friends were playing near the river. As a joke, one of the children pushed a boy into the river. He couldn't swim, and he sank to the bottom. Villagers tried to save the boy, but they were too late. They found him, sitting on a rock, eyes cloudy, mouth open. It was like he sat there and waited to drown. People say his ghost will grab your ankles, pull you into his watery grave. I freaked the fuck out. I tried to sell the house, but I couldn't because it's apparently famous for being haunted. I just hope I can get out of this place. A little background for context. This past Thanksgiving was hard for my family. It was the first Thanksgiving without my biological grandmother. I called her Nana. Her life partner is my other grandmother, who I call Nain. So, just wanted to get that out of the way. On Thanksgiving night, me, Nain, and my half-brother were sitting in the living room, reminiscing on past Thanksgiving we'd spent with Nana, when we heard something fall in the master bedroom. Nain had closed the door to keep the dogs out of there, so no one or nothing was in there. We brushed it off and decided to put a movie on, and we were watching it when we heard voices coming from that room. We paused the movie to listen, but we couldn't quite make out what they were saying. We assumed it was just the neighbors and were about to continue the movie when we heard a voice call out for Nain in my Nana's voice. Only it wasn't her. We all knew it. Again, she called out this time for me. This time the tone in her voice was urgent, like she was hurting. "Help me," we heard her cry. My older brother, who's never really encountered nor cared for the supernatural, was shaking as he tried to get up when Nain shouted, something she's never done.
"Don't open that door."
Again, we heard my Nana crying while pounding on the door. When at 11:52 p.m., it was quiet. That was the time she died. Till this day, we haven't spoken of what happened. Nain had me sage the entire house the next day. I was 8 or 9 when this happened. Every night around 2 a.m., I used to hear a hammering sound coming from the first floor of our 3-story house. The hammering sound always came from the first floor. I always thought my uncle may be responsible because he often complained that he couldn't sleep. I thought that he might have found a new hobby or something, but no one else ever mentioned the noise. Anyways, my bedroom was on the 3rd floor. It had a balcony with a wooden door. One night, my father was out of town and the rest of my family was asleep. So I decided to stay up all night and watch TV, but I fell asleep. I woke up to a loud banging sound coming from the balcony door. I immediately got up and asked in a brave voice, "Who's out there?" But the banging only got louder. I screamed. My mom rushed up to ask what was happening. I was crying, so she hugged me and asked again. As I was trying to tell her, the banging started again, and it was so brutal that I thought the door might break. Mom called Dad and his cop friend. When the officer came, he checked the balcony, but nothing was there. He even asked us to check in with him so that we wouldn't be afraid of our own house. Nothing like that ever happened again, and the hammering sound stopped as well. I never asked my family about that hammering because I'm still worried I might be the only one who heard it. When I was younger, we had this family friend named Joe. We called him Debinock. He was awesome, like one of those uncles who would spoil the shit out of you. He became sick one day and passed away when I was in school. I was in maybe 5th or 6th grade, so I didn't really know what was going on at the time. He was a diabetic, like my dad, but Joe's was worse. One of the last times I'd seen him was at my parents' place. I just got home from school. He was pale and seemed drowsy, silent. My dad told me he was sick and that he had something for me. It was a $5 bill. Before I got home and started to become aware of Joe's condition, My dad told me that he was seeing people that weren't there, like people who have already passed away, loved ones, just standing around in the living room, present. His condition grew dire. He couldn't leave his house or even get up to leave his bed, but his wife, Naomi, was taking good care of him. She had told us a story a few nights before his death. They'd had a horrifying experience. She was getting ready for bed and falls asleep next to her husband. She eventually wakes up to someone screaming her name. The bed is empty. Naomi realizes that the screaming is coming from the front door, and it's Joe's voice. He's shouting the words,
"Naomi, get the fuck out here and see this."
She jumps out of bed as fast as she could and she races towards the door. As she's halfway, she can hear the glass smash, followed by these loud, heavy footsteps stomping off and down the porch steps. She approaches the door and Joe is shaking, with this shocked expression, pointing off into the darkness. Naomi sees this shadowy figure bolting fast into the field not too far from their house. She was chilled to the bone, but was able to bring her husband back inside. It was peculiar. Joe was incapable of leaving his own bed, but was able to somehow, in the middle of the night, make it to the front porch with a glass of water for fresh air, where he was met by whatever that thing was. He never told anyone what he had seen. The scary thing is, he passed away while standing in the exact same spot. I was a nurse for 7 years, and I worked at a single facility for my entire career. The facility had many renovations done since opening in 1960. By 2011, when I started there, only half of the facility was still the original building. The rest had been added over the years. I worked nights, mostly because I'm a night owl and found it easier. I had a number of odd experiences, but I'll share the main ones that stick with me. Firstly, I've had experiences with the supernatural since age 3, so I believe in the supernatural but wasn't obsessed. It's more like I was simply aware of it, if that makes sense. There was one wing in particular, part of the original building, that had a small sitting room with a television for residents to enjoy during the day. During my night shifts, this one area gave me such a feeling of dread that I would only be near it when necessary. I took the long way back to the nurse's station just to avoid being near it. I don't know of anything that happened there, but my gut instinct screamed that something was there, and it was not happy. This feeling eased during the day, but each night the feeling was there. It felt as if someone was watching me, and they didn't like my presence. I spoke to a few other nurses about this, and they all claimed to experience the same feelings. One other incident that sticks with me: a 90-year-old woman I'll call Jane went to breakfast and then asked to return to her room for a nap. She was a very healthy woman, but she said she wasn't feeling well. When the nurse did her next rounds, 20 minutes later, she found that the resident had passed away in her sleep. It was an aortic aneurysm, so she didn't suffer. Unfortunately, death is rarely quick in aged care. It's usually a slow process of days or weeks. Jane was a very sweet Polish lady. She outlived her children, and her husband had passed away many years ago, so she never had visitors. At exactly 9:30 p.m., I would check on her, bring her tea before saying goodnight. As you can probably guess, not everything goes to schedule in healthcare, and it's not always possible to stick to a strict routine. But if I was even 5 minutes late, She would ring her call bell, ask for her tea, and apologize profusely for ringing her bell. Every time I answered with, "Whenever you need help, press the button. It's no trouble. I love to help." Then she would say her usual, "Good night, sweet girl," and I'd get on with my shift. The funeral home was late picking her up. I helped the undertaker that afternoon when I started my shift. All the rooms had call bells next to the toilet, next to the bed, and the residents wore one on a necklace or bracelet too. When a resident passes, the room bells are disconnected the same day, and the personal bell is put with the nurse's station, ready for the next person to move in. At 9:36, the call bell to her room started ringing. This was not possible. Her room had been disconnected, and her personal bell was sitting in a drawer next to me. Slightly freaked out, I went to her room to ensure no dementia patient had wandered in. I considered maintenance simply hadn't turned the bells off, even though I personally spoke to them after they did so. I was just trying to rationalize it, I guess. I went into the room, and it was pitch black. No one was inside, and the bells had definitely been turned off. I couldn't turn it off from inside the room. I had to cancel it from the main desk. I instantly had a feeling of peace, which was weird because in every other situation, I would have been a mess. I think she was saying goodbye. As I was closing her room, I heard a shriek. My best friend came running down the corridor crying and in a state. Once I got her calmed down, she said, "I was in X-Wing, charting, and Jane walked past me in her nightie. Then she turned the corner to the front wing, but when I looked around the corner, she wasn't there. She's dead. What the fuck did I just see?" Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode, but don't miss a brand new one every Friday night. And be sure to like this video, subscribe to The Darkest Hour, and tap the bell so you never miss a thing. I want to thank those who shared their stories, and a big thanks to all of you for listening. Huge shout out to all of my patrons who I appreciate so very much: Tracy S., Monica L., ZOEWATT, Shelly B., Donald C., Rat Girl, Alicia S., Aaron G., Nikki H., Mr. Revenant, and Naz K. If you want to support The Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining my Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour, or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.